HMS Abercrombie and her sister Roberts were the last 15-inch monitors built for the Royal Navy. As the Second World War was beginning and Winston Churchill retook his post as First Lord of the Admiralty, as in the First World War, he looked to familiarize himself with the ships of the Royal Navy, and especially the monitor fleet he had helped to create in 1914 and 1915. Where by the end of the war, the Royal Navy had some 40 monitors to bombard the occupied Belgian coast and Ottoman coastline in the Gallipoli campaign. However, when he looked in September 1939, he found very few, as many had been scrapped in the interwar period, with only several like Erebus, Marshal Soult, Marshal Ney, and several others still left in service. With Germany likely striking France through the Low Countries, Churchill realized coastal bombardment vessels could play a useful role once again there or in other possible theaters of the war, like the shallow waters of the southern North Sea or even in the Baltic. Along with the display HMS Terror had given in the Med, the Royal Navy had no problem ordering a replacement monitor. Abercrombie's design was based off of Roberts with slight adjustments. Abercrombie entered service in the spring of 1943, just in time for the invasion of Sicily and then Italy, where she had some unfortunate luck with mines that put her out of the war for the remainder of it. After the war, Abercrombie became the turret drill ship at Chatham in July 1946, and after serving in this role and the reserve, she was scrapped in the mid-1950s. As I mentioned in the introduction, HMS Terror performed excellently in her bombardments in the Mediterranean. Link in the description for her video. Still, Terror was sunk by German air attack. Because of that performance, the Admiralty had no problem ordering a replacement, and to speed the delivery of this new monitor, it was going to be a near replica of Roberts, with such minor modifications as could be incorporated without too much trouble. In June 1941, Terror's last commanding officer made several suggestions for improvements to the monitors, and I think they're pretty interesting. 1. A speed of 18 knots to enable the ship to move with the fleet. 2. Longer range guns, about 48,000 yards. 3. Carriage of own aircraft, given the shortage of spotting aircraft off North Africa. These were some major changes and would need an entirely new design, being considerably bigger than Roberts, while no existing naval gun the British had could even reach ranges of 40,000 yards. Some of his more modest suggestions were added, including larger storerooms and better fresh water capacity, better wireless facilities, heavier stern anchors, more motorboats, and better repair/workshop facilities. With the delivery planned for September 1942, the following differences were permitted. 1. 15-inch gun mountings brought up to the latest Mark I/N standard. 2. Deck armor over machinery spaces increased from 3 inches to 4 inches. Circular and slightly shorter barbette armor. 3. More close-range weapons, and remote power control RPC fitted to 4-inch and 2-pounder mountings. 4. Shelter deck extended to full breadth of main hull to provide more accommodation and better arcs of fire for 4-inch guns mounted thereon. 5. Extra storage for ammunition, stores, and fresh water. 6. Additional generating capacity necessitated by RPC and other additions, by substituting 2 150 kilowatt diesel generators for the 2 60 kilowatt, but retaining the 2 200 kilowatt turbo generators. 7. 3 instead of 2 motorboats, with only 1 pulling boat, a change which cramped the boat stowage even further, restricted as it was by the bulge to the extreme aft end. 8. Accommodation designed for up to 500 men. Various minor changes in layout and equipment, including taller funnel. These changes were found in Ian Buxton's Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945. Since Abercrombie was so similar to Roberts, we'll take a look back at that video and see what important naval history from the past has to say. As I mentioned previously, the Royal Navy built many monitors during the First World War, like HMS Lord Clive, who was eventually armed with an 18-inch gun. My video on her can be found in the description. Anyway, the Royal Navy built monitors armed with 14-inch, 12-inch, 15-inch, 18-inch, and others with odd-caliber guns like HMS Glatton, originally built as a Norwegian coastal defense ship. But by the time the Second World War kicked off in September 1939, that number had been reduced drastically, and so had the stockpile of spare large-caliber guns, meaning that for future vessels, it would be hard to find spare guns lying around for new monitors. Even the monitors on hand weren't in the best condition, Erebus being the best one. Others, like Marshal Soult, were in very poor condition, and by November 1939, Churchill was very anxious to have more monitors ready for service. With this in mind, a detailed survey of Soult was carried out, and it showed it was not worth reconstructing her. Still, as her turret was in reasonable enough condition, her twin 15-inch guns could be transferred to a new hull with more modern and powerful machinery. Preliminary design work began right away, and various proposals were developed to get 15-knot speed if possible. Taking hull lines derived from Erebus, the best build of the World War I monitors, it was estimated that 12 knots could be obtained on trials with about 3,500 horsepower, and an idea that was thought of with Lord Clive in the 12-inch monitors from the First World War, the machinery could be possibly diesel. Like those 12-inch monitors, Roberts would not get diesels. This time the reason being was the diesels would take longer to build than steam turbines, and with the ship needing to be delivered in 12 months, the quicker the better, and so steam turbines were used. Also, like the World War I ships, Roberts' design incorporated a torpedo bulge, which would provide good protection against torpedoes and mines for the 54-foot wide main hull. Her machinery spaces were smaller than Erebus, as she only had to accommodate 2 boilers on a preliminary displacement of 8,380 tons. A difference between the World War I vintage monitors and Roberts is how the protection was designed and constructed, as it took into consideration the threat of air attack, but otherwise they were very similar. The vertical protection was designed to resist a 6-inch naval gun or a 9-inch howitzer striking normally at 90 degrees. The horizontal protection was disposed at an angle of about 35 degrees to the horizontal, corresponding to the angle of descent of long-range projectiles. The side protection system below the water was designed on the pattern of the new King George V class battleships and fleet carriers under construction at the time, where Buxton again writes, "A 17-foot wide sandwich layer was arranged in the bulge abreast the vitals of the ship, consisting of an outer airspace, a jacket space partially filled with water, and an inner airspace, giving protection against torpedoes carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. The theory was that the detonation should take place as far as possible from the main hull proper. The outer airspace served to reduce the pressure pulse set up in the sea by the explosion. The middle water space or jacket absorbed, distributed, and dispersed the energy of the explosion over a wide area and reduced the momentum of splinters. The inner air jacket prevented the pressure waves in the water jacket from being transmitted to the protective bulkhead. Another change was that the protection was fitted on the main deck rather than the upper deck to reduce the height of the side armor. The forecastle deck extended right to the stern, unlike the World War I ships, with that level now being the upper deck and the old upper deck now being the main deck. Another interesting change was that of the conning tower, where the old cramped and uncomfortable circular conning tower of the World War I designs was dropped in favor of an armored compartment built into the bridge structure below the compass platform, as in the new battleships. As I previously stated, the main armament came from Marshal Soult, and although it was 25 years old, the 15-inch gun was still very effective. Apart from an overhaul and several modifications to load the new 15-inch ammunition, the turret was good to go for the ship. New fire control systems would be installed to modernize the battery further. As in the World War I monitors, Roberts would need other smaller caliber guns, and considering that she would likely be conducting offensive operations near an enemy's coast, she would need lots of anti-aircraft guns. The original suggestion of 6 high-angle guns as in Erebus and Terror was soon regarded as not adequate for Roberts. Others suggested the new 4.5-inch high-angle guns being fitted to the capital ships. Still, they were all being used by them, so the only remaining option was the twin 4-inch dual-purpose guns that formed the secondary battery of the cruisers. 2 twin 4-inch mountings were added on the port and starboard sides abreast the funnel. Light anti-aircraft guns were added as well, like the 2-pounder, with the half-inch machine gun being rejected. This would be further augmented throughout her career, including during her construction. The design work continued on the ship, and tweaks were made. The displacement crept to 8,675 tons, with a standard displacement of 7,505 tons. Some objections were raised to building a monitor at all, as the armor and other materials could be allocated elsewhere. These objections were overruled, and the design and the eventual construction of the ship continued. There were delays due to the shipment of components for the 15-inch turret as they were being shipped on the newly built coaster Goodwood. The parts on the ship shifted so violently that the crew thought the ship was sinking and abandoned ship. Once they realized their ship was not sinking, they sailed on, although it did take some time for them to realize. A new problem arose of where they were going to be stored as the cranes were all being used at the time. There were several weeks worth of delays, but some good news did come out of it. 8 single 20mm Oerlikons were added to the armament. Some more delays followed due to several factors, including modifications during the construction. But by October 1941, Roberts commissioned into the Royal Navy, where Buxton writes, "Although the layout of Roberts was similar to that of Erebus, there was no mistaking the final appearance of the two ships. The profile of the World War I monitor as built was bare. Virtually, the only erections above the deck were the turret, bridge, mast, and funnel, although subsequently extended during World War II. In contrast, Roberts had an extensive superstructure, her 2 masts and her radar aerials, considerable AA armament, a flush upper deck, and an external sloping armor belt on top of the bulge." Anyway, to take from Buxton once more, because I find this bit fascinating, Abercrombie arrived in the Clyde from Rosyth on May 9, 1943, for working up. Roberts arrived there on June 1st, now under the command of Captain R.E.C. Dunbar, who had been Lord Clive's navigating officer at the end of World War I. The two monitors engaged in lengthy bombardment practices, exercising, in particular, the spotting of the gunfire by shore observers. The British practice was to have a small team ashore consisting of an artillery officer called a forward observation officer, FOO, to spot the fall of shot and to estimate corrections, and a naval telegraphist to signal the bombarding ship. The gunnery officer was assisted by another artillery officer called a bombardment liaison officer, BLO, in carrying out the shoot as required by the troops ashore. Abercrombie carried out some more of her exercises with U.S. Shore Fire Control Parties, SFCP, as she would be supporting American forces in the forthcoming operations. Both monitors had been allocated together with the Erebus to provide gunfire support for the next phase of the Mediterranean combined operations. With North Africa now cleared of the enemy, the next step was to land in Europe itself, first on Sicily, then on the Italian mainland. The British 8th Army and the American 7th Army were to make an assault early in July on the southern coast of Sicily. The 3 monitors would be the only heavy gun ships in direct support, as the battleships assigned to Operation Husky were required to stand off to intercept any ships of the Italian fleet that might approach. Roberts and Abercrombie sailed from Clyde on the 18th of June as part of convoy KMS 17. With Roberts splitting off due to turbine trouble, Abercrombie went on to Tunis, arriving on the 4th of July, and after embarking a U.S. liaison officer and signalers who had trained with her in the Clyde, she joined convoy TJM-1, most of whose list had been assembling at Tunis to cover the landings of the easternmost of the American beaches, about 40 miles west of Cape Passero. The 2 newer monitors sailed for the invasion of Sicily on July 8th, their convoys making for the rendezvous point south of Malta, where over the coming days, bad weather slowed the landing craft and Abercrombie's convoy to a speed at which she could not be steered, so she had to pull ahead. Abercrombie arrived in position early in the morning on July 10th, where Buxton writes, "To obtain tactical surprise, no pre-H hour bombardments had been planned. The landing craft went soon after she had arrived. Conditions were not easy, although there was a little opposition. Her first call to fire came at 7:15 a.m. when she was asked to fire on inland targets, including Cosimo Airfield. Following counterattacks by enemy tanks, Abercrombie was ordered to help on the 11th. She opened fire on the town of Nishemi, 8 miles inland, and managed to knock out the enemy headquarters from a range of 30,000 yards. The supporting American cruisers and destroyers returned a huge volume of fire from their 6-inch and 5-inch guns on less distant targets. Abercrombie used her big guns to good effect also. Still, British records tend to be less comprehensive than Americans, and details of her targets and ammunition expenditure are not available, although she claimed a 5-gun enemy battery destroyed with 5 rounds. The counterattack was beaten back. Little Dumbo, as the Americans nicknamed Abercrombie, scoring a direct hit on one tank that came down a hillside road in full view from the sea. Most of the spotting had been done by those on the ground, as although the cruisers carried observation seaplanes, the latter were vulnerable to enemy fighters during their early period when the air cover was poor. As the Americans pushed in on the 13th and the 14th, Abercrombie bombarded Porto Empedocle and Agrigento on the 7th Army's west flank in company with U.S. cruisers, and over the coming days, she engaged 10 separate targets, including Italian railway batteries. There was return fire, but the shells fell short. By the evening, Abercrombie had expended nearly all of her ammunition, so she went to Malta to replenish, returning on the 18th to Gela. By now, the Americans were steadily advancing, and there was little need for her as the Army's artillery and the U.S. cruisers and destroyers were more than capable of dealing with the bombardment needs. After a period as a radar guard ship, she returned therefore to Malta on the 23rd before sailing to Bizerta to prepare for the invasion of Italy. With the Germans out of Sicily, the Allies were planning for the invasion of the mainland as soon as the necessary forces could be assembled, meaning Abercrombie and the other monitors would have work to do. Abercrombie was allocated to support the British landings at the northern end of the Gulf of Salerno, departing Bizerta on the morning of the 7th of September. As the landing forces were departing, news of the Italian armistice with the Italian government was broadcasted, giving them some optimism that there would be less resistance, but the Germans at Salerno were well prepared. Early on the morning of the 9th, at 8:25 a.m., Abercrombie received her first call to fire at an enemy battery near the town of Capaccio, about 5 miles inland. The spotting aircraft had difficulty spotting the target in the morning mist, so it took 50 minutes to get off 11 rounds without any observed results. Overhead, there were problems for the bombarding Allied forces, as there were HE-111s on one side and Bf-109s on the other. These frequent air attacks made sure the anti-aircraft gunners of the invasion force kept busy. 3 more calls came that morning, all at ranges of 27,000 yards. In the meantime, minesweepers were hard at work, clearing several channels, and had exploded a number of mines. At one point in the morning, Abercrombie was warned that she was standing in danger, so she retreated her course. As the channels had not yet been properly buoyed, it was difficult to keep in the safe area, and later that day at around 5 p.m., Abercrombie slowly drifted into an area left unswept, and 3 minutes later, a large explosion occurred amidships on the starboard side. Abercrombie hit a contact mine in about 450 feet of water. It had gone off under the starboard bulge, and taking from monitors of the Royal Navy, had the fleet brought the great guns to bear by Jim Crosley. Unfortunately, there had not been time to buoy the cleared areas properly, and Abercrombie drifted into an unswept zone. Just after 5 p.m., she struck a large moored contact mine, estimated to contain 500 pounds of explosives. This tore open her protective bulge, and she left with a 10-degree list to starboard. The port bulge was flooded to correct this, causing her to float very deep in the water. Damage to the main parts of the ship had been slight, and thanks to her bulges, she could still steam and maneuver. There was only one serious casualty. The ship had no welding gear aboard, but as usual, the U.S. Navy was well equipped with support services, and the U.S. tug Moreno came and helped to make temporary repairs. Abercrombie was then able to depart for Palermo on her own steam. The most serious damage was to her vitaled fire director control system, which had made it impossible for her to make use of her main armament. U.S. soldiers ashore must have been sad to see that they would no longer have the support of Little Dumbo's killer punch. After temporary repairs in Palermo, she went to the Italian dockyard at Taranto, now in Allied hands, where she was fully repaired. From there, she was sent on to Malta, where she set about retraining her crews for further action, but luck was not on her side. On August 24th, she struck 2 more mines close to the island. These had probably been laid by German aircraft. She was extensively damaged and had to stagger into the Grand Harbor for repairs. Abercrombie would never fight again, as she spent the next 11 months repairing this damage and taking from Buxton again. After the surrender of Japan, Abercrombie arrived back at Sheerness on 6 November 1945 to be placed into reserve. Initially used as an accommodation ship, she replaced Erebus as turret drill ship at Chatham in July 1946, lying at moorings in the Medway. Later, her role was that of a living ship for the Nore Reserve Fleet. In the spring of 1953, she was towed to Portsmouth and laid up at Fareham Creek until November 1954, when she was handed over to Biscoe for scrapping, allocated to Ward's Barrow Yard. She arrived on Christmas Eve. Demolition work started almost immediately, but it was 3 weeks before there arrived from the Admiralty the list showing the items to be salvaged for return to naval stores. In addition to the usual things such as electrical equipment and spare parts, the 8 4-inch guns were included. Still, by the time the Ward was notified, these had been mutilated beyond further use in accordance with the standing instructions for gunnery equipment. In preparing the 1955 to 1956 Naval Appropriation Account, the Auditor General drew attention to the resulting £25,000 loss and asked for a tightening up of Admiralty procedures concerning equipment to be returned from ships to be scrapped. Abercrombie can be seen as an unlucky ship, as she had problems with mines and saw little service. However, for the most part, she kept her crew safe, and in what little service she did see, she was effective, showing her excellent qualities as a cost-effective bombardment unit. Let me know what you all think about Abercrombie and whether she was lucky or unlucky. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.